So I'm going to share my screen if I am so allowed. It looks like I am indeed allowed. Okay, I am just checking. Are you guys seeing presenter view or the regular view?
We're seeing presenter view.
Yep.
How about now?
That's great.
Okay, great. It's hard with my monitors. It's always a game and I never really know the answer. Okay, so we're going to talk about air quality, energy use, and energy efficiency. And this is part of a collaboration that Julie and Dr. Powell and I have been talking about for quite a while, and it is starting to come to fruition. So we're very excited about this. So there is a very strong overlap between air quality, energy, and energy efficiency. And I'm guessing that several of you are aware of this. But air quality is really important because the World Health Organization estimates that more than 90% of people live in the world, live where air quality does not meet health guidelines. So this is important for the vast majority of people in the world. And then it's estimated that about 7 million people die prematurely. That's 1 in 8 total global deaths as a result of air pollution. And it causes more than $21 billion in healthcare costs. So it's a big social and economic burden for all of us. And in fact, one challenge that Utah faces with its periodic episodes of poor air quality are pictures in places like the Los Angeles Times of like a big pool of haze and how Utah struggles with air quality. So this is a challenge not only for us because we live here, but it's also a challenge as we try to recruit new businesses and top talent. So we're going to talk a little bit about global energy, US regulations, and then why that is important and why the companies that you go visit are probably very interested in this. And then I'm going to talk about some other opportunities. And then, so one of the biggest problems with the sort of energy air quality link is that energy production and use, a lot of it, especially in other parts of the world, is unregulated, and there are still a lot of poorly regulated and inefficient fuel combustion, and that's really the single most important source of air pollutant emissions. I don't know if some of you have ever been to some of the places that are notorious for poor air quality, like India or China. And it's pretty fascinating the types of things you're seeing people do, from burning just about everything they can find to stay warm in India in November to actually, it's pretty interesting. I don't know if people know, but in China, they still use a lot of district heating, which if you use combined heat and power can be super efficient. On the other hand, that's often done with widely distributed, very inefficient coal-fired power plants. So there's a lot of local coal burning that is completely uncontrolled. So anyways, globally, this is a big deal. These types of combustion is responsible for 85% of all particulate matter and almost all SOx and NOx emissions. So poverty and solid fuel burning are a huge deal for health. And then there's also, as the world becomes increasingly urbanized, there's a lot more vehicle emissions and power plants. And even as the US has moved away from coal, globally, there are still coal-fired power plants coming online. Okay, so this is just some of our biggest pollution sources in the world. So over 99% of sulfur emissions come from energy production. Same for nitrogen, high percentage of particulate matter, carbon dioxide, 92%, and then volatile organic compounds, about 2/3. And just a little bit of ammonia. It turns out agriculture and other sources are very big sources of ammonia, but not so much energy. Okay, so a little bit as you get from sources to impacts and why people care. So we've got sources related to human activities. We've got power plants, we've got industry, we've got households, and then we've also got natural sources like wildfires, which we've been experiencing a lot lately, volcanoes, dust storms, sea spray, not such a huge deal here in Utah, but in some parts of the world, a big deal. Then this is actually important distinction. There are primary emissions, and I think people like Andrew who have taken atmospheric science classes will know the difference between this. So there are primary emissions. Those are emissions that come directly from their tailpipe, as let's say NOx emissions may come directly from the tailpipe. And you might have particulate matter. So from a diesel engine, you might get particles coming out of a diesel engine. On the other hand, there are also reactions that happen in the atmosphere that cause the production of pollutants. Those are called secondary pollutants. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But so here in Utah, during our wintertime inversions, only about a third of the particles we see come out of their source as a particle. The rest are formed in the atmosphere. And when we talk about ozone and other important pollution, that is all formed secondarily. So from precursors such as nitrous oxide emissions and VOCs. And then you've also got weather and topography. So here is where Utah does struggle a little bit with some of our pollutants because we're surrounded by mountains. Pollution can sink in our valley. Warm air can move over the top of that pool of pollution and it acts like a lid. So that is one of the reasons we struggle with air quality. And then in the summer, we are also hot and sunny, which is a big driver of ozone pollution. Okay, so this was the difference between primary and secondary, and then a little bit about how for our particle pollution during the winter, we are dominated by secondary pollution. So it is very important to understand these reactions and the precursors, and that these are actually pretty complicated. Okay, a little bit about regulations. So prior to 1963, it was sort of a free-for-all. And if you talk to anybody who lived in Utah back in like the early 1900s, I think some of those folks are still around and kicking, but air quality was just horrible. And that's because it was basically a free-for-all. People were burning coal to heat their homes. There was a lot of, actually it was mostly combustion, but not a lot of control, very inefficient processes. And again, we're surrounded by mountains, so air quality was actually was quite terrible, and this continued even though as things improved, we've continued to struggle with air quality because even though we've gotten a lot better and a lot more efficient with everything we do, a lot more people have moved into this valley. So, anyways, in 1963. The US decided we had to do something. We're not the only place. In fact, I believe it was Donora, Pennsylvania, that had what they called a killing fog. So there were a number of people that died because the air quality got so bad. There was a coal-fired power plant and they got a very strong temperature inversion for several weeks, and a number of people died because of this. So that and other catastrophic events sort of initiated this need for air pollution regulation. Okay, so this started in 1963, and there have been amendments, and the last significant set of amendments were in the 1990s. And then EPA started in 1971, and they are, their first priority was to protect us from the environment, and as a second priority, it was to protect the environment from us. So we are big contributors to some of the challenges the environment faces. A couple of regulatory highlights that I'll talk about are national ambient air quality standards, and then industry performance standards, and a little bit about the regulation of air toxics. Some of the other things are not as relevant to the IIAC, so I won't really talk about them. Okay, this is one of the key things that's useful to understand about air quality and standards. So the EPA has developed standards for 6 what they call criteria pollutants. So these indicate whether or not air quality is healthy where you live or not. And they have set up a network of monitoring stations, and you will find these in areas where you have population of a certain density. So there are many areas of the country where there's no monitoring whatsoever. But along the Wasatch Front, we probably have about 15 monitoring stations. And again, this has to do with the density of population. So basically, EPA has these advisory committees that meet, or actually used to meet until the current administration came into place and stopped many of these boards from meeting or reconstituted the boards. But anyways, these boards used to contain experts with expertise in toxicity, in animal health, or in public health, and in policy, and they would all get together and look at data and try to figure out what levels of certain of these air quality metrics are needed to protect our health. And let's say most of us are pretty healthy without pre-existing conditions, and you want to protect not only our health but the health of sensitive populations. So they would get together every 5 years or so and review the latest data and try to set good air quality, try to set what they think is a good and healthy level for these what they call criteria pollutants. And these are particulate matter, which is PM 2.5 and PM 10. And those 2.5 and 10 have to do with the size, the diameter of the particles, and how easily they can pass into your lungs. So it turns out that particles that are bigger than 10 microns in diameter don't really make it very far through into our lungs. And so they're not considered to be a terrible concern, but as you get smaller, these particles can make it all their way deep into our lungs, where they are a big concern. We have criteria for ozone. I'll talk a little bit about what that is and why we are worried about it, as well as particulate matter. For NOx, these are nitrous oxide emissions. This comes primarily from combustion. For carbon monoxide, also from combustion. SOx, combustion, and also related to refining and metal smelting. And lead, okay? So EPA gets together with their science advisory boards. They set what they believe are standards to maintain the public health. And then we've got ambient measurements. They take measurements and they compare them against these health standards. These health standards, or the comparison is actually a little complicated. They take 3 years of data for each location, and then they take the 98th percentile of that data, and then they figure out, have you made the ambient air quality standard or not? So you do get a few whoopses, and then you also get a few not my problems. So not my problem means, let's say we were affected by wildfires from California. And so they won't count that against us, but there's a lot of work to be done to document that, okay? And then after they've got this data, they declare you as attainment or non-attainment. And if you're in attainment, everything's groovy. All you need to do is keep taking measurements. If you are not in attainment, you have to develop a plan. And this plan is actually quite painful. I served on the air quality board for 8 years, and a big part of our effort was developing plans to improve our air quality for fine particulate matter during our wintertime inversions. And those plans entail modeling, going back to sources that you have control over and trying to like put the screws on them to reduce their emissions, and then coming up with broader regulations for things that we use, like consumer products and classes of industry. So we'll talk a little bit about what those are and then why that's relevant for the IAC. So any questions from anybody? Julie?
Kerry, the non-attainment or the attainment status, is that an annual determination?
That is a great question. So it is basically annual, but it's based on the last 3 years of data. So EPA will look at your last 3 years of data and they'll say, okay, so you know it's coming if you're not in attainment. And so the state knows we're actually about to be declared non-attainment for ozone. So so we know that this is coming because we know what the measurements are.
And I guess, are you going to go into the Utah state of the industry or not? Otherwise, I'll ask a question.
I'm going to talk a little bit about non-attainment and where those non-attainments are, but I won't talk about the state of the industry, so go ahead.
Oh, I was just kind of curious about the trends for these criteria pollutants, like you were saying for ozone. So I take it the state has been in an attainment, but about to cross over. Is that typical or not?
Okay, so this gets back into the whole story. So it's a mixture of everything that happened. So So it's our emissions. That's a big part of it. And that's really all we can control. And that's what gets regulated. It's meteorology, which we have no control over, unless some of you have a higher power that I'm not aware of. Then, and then that's really it. And I was going to throw in policies and things that we sort of have a little bit of control about, like population growth and planning and whatnot. So those three things really factor in. And it turns out we have actually made it in terms of fine particulate matter in the winter. So we just went from being declared non-attainment to now being declared as a maintenance area, which is great. But you have to be aware that it is a little bit of a double-edged sword because we are so affected by weather for our wintertime inversions. We have had 3 relatively warm, wet, and stormy winters. So that tends to sort of break up pollution. If we get walloped with a couple very cold, very stagnant air winters, we could be back in non-attainment. But then for ozone, because a lot of that's driven by warm temperatures and sun, and we've been getting warmer, so that just drives that ozone pollution. And EPA recently lowered the standard, I think about 3 years ago, based on health data. So we are fixing to be declared non-attainment for ozone. I guess the benefit is the trends from industry have been going down. Okay, we'll talk about different classes of industry, but because the state is somewhat limited in what they can actually regulate. So the state can regulate these large industries. So the ones you kind of think of with the, with the stacks, the refineries, the Kennecotts, there's like Nucor Steel up north. So these larger industries, the state has authority to regulate. However, these smaller industries, the ones that IIAC works with, have not been as heavily regulated. They may be regulated as a class, or if they have certain types of operations, but they don't receive as much scrutiny as the big guys. So the big guys have been heavily regulated, and their emissions have gone down. We've also benefited because vehicles have gotten a lot cleaner in the last 15 years. And so that's actually where our biggest benefits have come. And then the state has passed rules about things like water heaters, believe it or not, hairspray. I don't know how many of you are heavy hairspray users, but if you use a very firm, like, people that used to wear beehives, that used very firm hairspray, some of those were no longer available in Utah. And and there's certain consumer products that are no longer available. There's also restrictions on wood burning. So all those things together have led to reductions in emissions. However, one of the challenges is population keeps growing. So these things are going in 2 different directions. So as you bring more people into the airshed, you have to get smarter and smarter about how you control emissions and what technologies you use. So that was a very long answer to your question.
I have a question, Dr. Kelly.
Sure, Blake.
This attainment status is a statewide designation. Does it go lower, like regionally? Because we are a large state, right? So
yes, yeah, and I'm going to show you some maps. That's a great question. I'll show you some maps of where we're in non-attainment, and this is also really important for the IAC and why companies might be really motivated to take some energy efficiency actions that could result in air quality benefits.
Great.
Okay. Dr. Kelly, I was just going to mention one other thought about the connection between air emissions and energy efficiency relates to the refrigerants that are being used in some of the equipment that we work with, right? And I noted here that the CFCs are not the criteria pollutants.
Yes. Okay, so CFCs are very important for global climate change and important for the companies, and they're also quite expensive. So, but they are not generally considered as contributors to our non-attainment problems. But great question. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure, Jake.
So you said we're potentially going to go out of non-attainment for PM 2.5, but in my mind, that kind of seems like a bad thing because we had 3 maybe good weather years, but that doesn't really tell the picture, isn't it? We want to be in non-attainment, so we take action, right? Or so the state makes us take action.
Yeah, okay. So this is a whole prescriptive process that is governed by EPA, and it is what they call codified in the Federal Register. So it would take a lot of work to change the way this happens. And yes, you are right. You know, we're going to be out of attainment, but if we get a couple bad weather years, we're going to be back in non-attainment, and they're going to be back at another plan. So yeah, we want to keep the feet to the fire. On the other hand, there's a whole problem with the process. And the problem with the process is the state is very limited on what they can regulate. And they have long ago regulated they have long ago gotten the low-hanging fruit. So what they're doing is continuing to like chip away at things. But that's also where I think the IAC has a lot of benefits, because I think there are opportunities, especially in these smaller companies or smaller emitting sources, because they haven't been undergone the kind of scrutiny that the large sources have. And this sort of class of emissions, what they call area sources. So this is all of us, our home heating, all the nail polish remover and all the hairspray we use, all the paints, coatings, strippers. So this is all of us plus all this light industry. So these are, trying to think, these are commercial graphic locations. These are body shops. These are small industry that does all kinds of things that just, they don't have enough emissions that they meet the standard that the state looks at them very closely. So, so I think this is really where the next opportunity for improving air is. Okay, any more questions? But great questions, everyone. Okay, so I'm just going to tell you a little bit about some of these pollutants. So carbon monoxide used to be a problem about 20 years ago, 20 or 30 years ago. And that was because we weren't all that great at combustion. We've gotten a lot better at combustion. Carbon monoxide is really important. And you've probably heard horrible stories of someone with a malfunctioning heater and doesn't have a CO sensor in their house. The family never wakes up in the morning, which is horrible. So carbon monoxide can be deadly. It is very important. But because we've gotten so much better in terms of outdoor pollutants, carbon monoxide is not a problem anywhere in the US. Sulfur dioxide has also been a problem in the US, and this has been a big success story. It's mostly emitted from fossil fuels combustion, also some smelters and refineries, but these large sources have been heavily regulated, and basically sulfur dioxide is not really a problem anymore. We have one site in Utah that periodically measures sulfur dioxide to just sort of keep an eye on the Kennecott smelter, but we used to be in non-attainment for sulfur dioxide and we're not anymore. It's also important for acid rain, particularly in the East Coast. It's actually, acid rain, interestingly, is not a problem in Utah. Anybody have any idea why? Any gardeners out there? It turns out, sorry.
I was going to guess it's because we're in a desert, but that's probably not it.
Good, yeah, that's a good guess. We have actually very alkaline soil. So if you were going to try to grow azalea bushes, they wouldn't be very happy, or blueberries. They both those like alkaline soils. So, like more acidic soils. And we have alkaline soil. So when we get acid rain, our soil sort of takes care of it. I mean, it still is a problem for leaves and whatnot, but it's not as much of a problem as it is in the East Coast. But anyways, two pollutants that are not so much of a problem, but I would consider that that is a success. And that also goes back to why the regulations tend to focus on these big industries, because we've had such great success with things like sulfur and carbon monoxide. Okay, lead, another thing that's not so much a problem anymore when we got rid of leaded fuel in the 1970s. And in fact, our IQs have increased since then. So it turns out that was actually a great move on our part. So we're all a little bit smarter now. Well, maybe I'm not, because I was born in the late 60s. So, but anyways, those of you who were born after that are probably now smarter. So good on you. NOx. So another pollutant that we've seen a decline in, which has been great, but it hasn't been quite as dramatic. It's produced almost entirely by combustion. This is important not only because it's direct emissions and it leads to inflammation in healthy people, respiratory problems, but it also is very important in the formation of both particle pollution and ozone. So those are two key problems here in Utah. So NOx is still very important. You've probably talked some about NOx. I think, Julie, have they talked about NOx in some of their assessments when they look at boilers and things, or no?
Actually, with Taufik's help, we're just starting to add that aspect.
Okay, yeah, so NOx is also, it's very important, tightly linked with energy. So one place where our work totally overlaps. And I know you're starting to work with Dr. Pershing. He is an expert on NOx. He was one of the people that started to understand this mechanism of how NOx is formed and how NOx can be controlled. Okay, ozone. This is one of our big problems. So we have two big problems in Utah. One is particulate matter. The other is ozone. So ozone forms when you have oxides of nitrogen, volatile organic compounds, and sunlight. Here in the summer, we have lots of sunlight. There's really not much we can do about that. So the only thing we can work on here is decreasing the emissions of NOx and decreasing the emissions of volatile organic compounds. And we actually have been doing that over the years. The challenge is that, that we've been getting a little warmer, and the warmer you are, the faster this reaction goes. So we experience high levels of ozone. And in fact, this is also a little bit of a weird pollutant where you can get very high levels of ozone in very rural areas because some of the precursors are transported, and the higher you are, the higher the intensity of solar radiation. So you can be out, you know, someplace that appears very pristine and have very high levels of ozone. What else was I going to tell you about ozone? It can trigger a variety of health problems. It can induce and exacerbate asthma. Those are sort of the big two health effects. And then also worsen bronchitis and challenges for people with emphysema. And we are about to be classified as non-attainment for ozone. And I'll show you a map of where this is going to be, but this is going to happen. It's not, it takes EPA a little while to work through the process, but we are well on our way to being classified as non-attainment. Okay, and so part of that is the EPA recently lowered its standard from 75 ppb to 70 ppb. I'll tell you a little bit more about ozone. Another thing is somebody might ask me, what about ozone? Isn't that good? Well, it's really good up high because that protects us from solar radiation. That's stratospheric ozone. That's the ozone we want. That's another regulation that turned out to be very successful by regulating the some of the chlorofluorocarbons that were causing depletion of that ozone layer. That has actually been probably one of the most successful air quality regulations. By getting rid of those, we have now managed to repair part of that hole, and we believe we are well on our way to having that problem addressed. So that was success of our regulation. Okay, one problem for the Wasatch Front and for the Uinta Basin, which I'll just touch on briefly, is that background levels in the ozone are high in the west because we are sunny and we are high. There's a transport of ozone precursors, not only from California, so the prevailing winds come from the west, but also from Asia. And that has been increasing. So we have about 1/2 ppb of precursor emissions that lead to about 1/2 ppb of ozone every year coming to the west. And then also, again, because we're at high altitude, you can actually get stratospheric intrusion of ozone. So I talked about that ozone layer being good. So during strong thunderstorms, you can actually get intrusions of ozone at ground level. So those are important for us in the west. And then this map actually shows that background levels of ozone, if you get rid of all man-made sources, you're looking at levels in the Intermountain West of about 55 ppb, and if you were in New Mexico, you're at 60. And if the standard is 70, that doesn't give you a whole lot of room for any anthropogenic emissions. And there are places that have been declared non-attainment for ozone that have nothing in them but an interstate. There's no source to control. So that the problem with that is, like, what are you going to do? So
Dr. Kelly, anthropogenic is just the emissions that occur because of your life and living.
This is, yeah, it's called anything that's man-made. So these are any sort of US man-made emissions. So these estimates include emissions from other countries and sort of natural emissions. So we also we have emissions from our plant life that actually emits VOCs. And there is some natural wildfire events. So those are all going to contribute to ozone. So somebody went through and modeled this and figured out that in the Western US, we just have very high background levels of ozone. So meeting ozone standards in this part of the country is a challenge. And there was actually a big fight over the lowering of the ozone standard from the Western and the Eastern US, because the Eastern US it's easier for them to make reductions, and there are health benefits associated with it. But the way it works is, you're not supposed to consider how hard it is to do. You're only supposed to consider the health benefits when you do this, when you set the health standards. Okay, any questions?
Sorry, I have a question.
Sure, Matteo.
So when ozone is generated at ground level, does it ever go up?
Does it ever, what do you mean? Does it ever get transported to the stratosphere?
Mm-hmm.
Generally not. Ozone is very reactive, and that's why it's not good for you, because it reacts with the surface of the lungs, but it tends to react with something else before it would have a chance to get there. Good question. Any other questions?
I had one more.
Sure thing.
This is going to be a little pessimistic, but do you feel like we're making any progress in this? In that, like, I feel like there's just a new wildfire every single year, and there's just so many things that are happening. So do you feel like we're actually moving forward with this, or are we still kind of trying to stop a backslide?
Actually, we are moving forward. We have reduced our man-made emissions in this valley substantially. I'd have to look at the numbers, but I think we have reduced our NOx emissions by we've reduced our NOx emissions by about a third. We've removed VOC emissions by about another third. We've reduced about 30 to 40% of particulate matter emissions. And this is in spite of the fact that our population has continued to grow. Okay, so we are doing a better job, but there are a couple challenges. One is the population's growing. So no matter what we do, we're gonna have to keep doing it. We're gonna have to keep looking for that next strategy. The next challenge is wildfires. So that, what I was talking about, generally excludes wildfires. And because of climate change and forest management and funding of forest management, we are probably in trouble in terms of wildfires for the foreseeable future. I guess on the other hand, I think we have to control what we can control. And that includes reducing emissions so that our air quality is better in the winter. And I think we have seen that. And then also reducing all of our precursors. So even when we don't have a wildfire event, that we are in better shape in terms of ozone. I guess the good news is the work we've done to reduce emissions for our particulate emission problem is also helps us with ozone, because they're the very same precursors. So NOx and VOCs also contribute to particulate matter formation.
Cool, thank you.
Okay.
Follow-up question, if you don't mind me asking, about those reductions. I'm curious if the Salt Lake area is either VOC or NOx limited, or if it's considered a transition zone, and therefore if there's a focus on one of those two in terms of next steps.
Okay, so this is actually a raging research question right now. So it appears that there are times during a wintertime inversion, there are times when we're NOx limited and times when we're VOC limited, and it changes. And there was a really nice article out. It's called the Odd Oxygen Framework. If you send me an email, I can send you the paper, but it does talk about this. And it talks about how, it talks about the chemistry and the rate limiting steps. And so that is not an easy question to answer.
Thanks, I appreciate it. I'll follow up with an email.
Yeah, no problem. Any other questions?
Dr. Kelly, you know Anne's cheating, right? Anne managed air quality programs in the Denver area as part of her professional experience.
I knew she had done something like that, but yeah.
Yes, so I worked for the Denver area's lead SIP organization.
Yeah.
So.
And were they NOx or VOC limited, or did they know?
Also a bit of a disagreement, but I think most people went with VOC limited.
Okay.
The biggest problem in Denver is ozone, right? They were declared serious non-attainment in December last year. I remember that.
Yep, I mean, they didn't meet the 97 standard, the 2008, so then 2015. I mean, it's, you're looking at 82 ppb a couple of years ago. So definitely their biggest issue.
Okay, great questions and comments, everyone. Thanks. Okay, just a little bit about PM 2.5. This is actually the driver of adverse health effects of all the pollutants. Okay, so if you looked at that 7 million comment about premature deaths, the majority of that is due to fine particulate matter pollution. And if you follow this, like every week there's a new study that it is associated with something else. Autism, but these are the sort of key health effects. It's associated with strokes, loss of mental function, emphysema, chronic bronchitis, asthma, lung cancer, heart attacks, arrhythmias. And what's kind of interesting is you would think the lungs are the place that would be most effective, and people do not totally understand why, but it's cardiovascular and cerebrocardial effects. So it's strokes and heart attacks that seem to be getting people. There is evidence that this has to do with a whole inflammatory cascade that is caused by particulate matter. But again, this is also a very active area of research. And then we know here in Utah that increased levels of particulate matter are associated with asthma, premature births, school absences, and emergency room visits. Okay, and the effects on children are pronounced. And one of the sad effects is that if you live in an area with elevated particulate matter, you have lost IQ points. So maybe what you gained from not having lead, you just lost from having more particulate matter. So not good for us, not good for the next generation. So something we really need to address for health. And there are World Health Organization guidelines. This is kind of interesting because EPA's 24-hour PM 2.5 standard is 35 micrograms per cubic meter. But the World Health Organization is 25 micrograms per cubic meter. And the American Thoracic Society came out and said, oh, it should be 25. But EPA at this point, I don't think is going to be making regulations stricter. But administrations may change, and you may see us, if we go down to 25 in Utah, we'll be back in non-attainment. Okay, any other questions about some of the pollutants?
Sorry, I'm asking a bunch, but with the IQ points, does that affect adults, or is it just like adolescents and children that are affected?
Well, when you don't have them as an adult, you don't get them back as when you don't have IQ, when you don't gain those IQ points as a child, you don't get them back as an adult. In fact, as we get older, we get dumber. So we all have a lot to look forward to. When you're like my age, I think you allegedly compensate by experience and maybe a little bit of maturity. But as you get older and older, you see that, we generally do lose a little bit of brain function. So yeah, this happens with all of us. So I think, I don't know developmentally when this happens, but I think your the ability of your brain to absorb new material sort of peaks around in early adolescence, and then we all start to decline. So I hate to break this to us all, but we're all on the decline.
I had another question.
Sure.
So far we've only talked about reducing emissions as a way to reduce pollutants, but is there anything being done about actually reducing the pollutants that are already in air, or do you just rely on natural processes to flush them away?
Yeah, so the pollutants I'm talking about are not greenhouse gas. That greenhouse gases is a whole additional that I did not talk about today. And those are very long-lived pollutants that that are very difficult to remove from the atmosphere. The pollutants I'm talking about tend to be removed readily from the atmosphere. And one of the reasons that we focus on these pollutants is because they are reactive, like ozone, or they transport things that are bad for us directly into our lungs, and they tend to have bad health effects, immediate sort of. I'm trying to figure out the best way to answer this question, but they have health effects both in the short term and then potentially chronically over the long term. What the other types of pollutants like greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere for a long time and then have systemic effects on our environment that then relate to adverse health effects. But I have not talked about this in this class because they're not a criteria pollutant. EPA does have the authority to regulate them, but this is actually very controversial, and this is back in the courts again. So the EPA had a greenhouse gas rule, and they were in the process of implementing that. And the court, because of a variety of court decisions, they have pretty much stepped back from that and regulating it. But I'm not saying that it's not a problem. It's just not what I focused on in today's lecture, because that would be a whole additional lecture if you can't feel like you can't get enough. So
yeah, I just meant with these particular pollutants, so reducing the actual the pollutants in air right now is not really a concern, is basically my question.
Yeah, so the way to do that is really to focus on emissions, because their lifetime, and if you look at their residence time in the atmosphere of something you emit right now, it's just not that long. So if you have ozone in the air right now, by tonight, the concentration will go way down because it's so reactive and you're not producing it anymore. And so with particulate matter, if you get some good mixing or a little bit of wind, it's gone.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Okay. Okay. So this is where this becomes a little bit more important for point source controls. And then, Julie, how long does this class go?
Technically till 10:30.
Oh, okay. So we've got 1 more minute. So we did not make it through the rest of the class. Okay, so I will very quickly, in 2 minutes, tell you the key things you need to know. One is the reason companies want to work with the IAC is because they do not want to become what's called a major source over here, okay? That means you're subject to lots of regulations. They want to do what they can to avoid being a major source. So I've defined what a major source is. It may change a little bit depending upon non-attainment status. You want to stay as a minor source or a source that's not even on the radar screen, okay? However, this is where the IAC, I think this is the sweet spot. So working with these companies, because they're motivated to keep air quality good in general for all of us, and because they want to stay a minor source. They do not want to be subject to all these permitting requirements. It's super expensive. It's super painful. Okay. I just want to show you really quickly. These were the non-attainment areas for fine particulate matter, and we're going to move to maintenance. However, this still means that we don't want a lot of new sources either emitting PM 2.5 or precursors to 2.5. So if you're working in any of these areas, you are going to be concerned about particle pollution. Okay, blah, blah, blah. Where does it come from? We don't care. Okay.
Dr. Kelly, where is this, what is the source for that map?
This was EPA and the state. They finally agreed on that map. Okay, so this map is a preliminary map for ozone non-attainment. Okay, so what happens is the state and the EPA, they get together and they agree what their non-attainment area is, and there's a little bit of back and forth about what should be in and what should be out. So this is a preliminary map for non-attainment for PM 2.5. This is not yet agreed on because we haven't been yet declared non-attainment. But if you look at what they call what they call the design value, so that 3-year rolling average 98th percentile, we're at 76 in Salt Lake, and we need to be under 70, and we're nowhere near that. So this is what they think the non-attainment area will be for ozone. And then also in the Uinta Basin, I don't know, Julie, does the IAC do much work in the basin? A little bit, okay. So the Uinta Basin is also gonna be non-attainment for ozone. So they're gonna be in the process of making plans, but there's gonna be a lot of emphasis in reducing emissions of VOCs and NOx in these areas, okay? And then the places that were PM 2.5 non-attainment are still gonna wanna be good citizens, and their feet are still to the fire in terms of emissions. So these are areas of the state, and this went to, I think, Blake's question, is it broken down? And yes, it is. So these are the key things I wanted to tell you. What else did I want to tell you? I just wanted to say that I think that there are a lot of opportunities because generally energy efficiency equals reduced emissions. One of the challenges is that most of our electrical savings, that comes from outside of the air sheds that we're worried about. However, ozone is a regional pollutant, so there are benefits to reducing emissions at regional power plants. There's also a lot of opportunities for indoor air and smart buildings. And I was actually had a conversation with Chris Benson. I think you guys know him from at the University of Utah facilities. And he just said, you know, we've got a really interesting questions about how do you manage indoor air quality during some of our pollution episodes like wildfire smoke. Because you want to keep everybody safe and healthy indoors, but you also have a building to manage, and using super effective filters costs more energy. So anyways, some interesting questions we could look at together. So thanks everyone for all the questions.
Thank you, Dr. Kelly. We can schedule another round for you in future classes. This is fantastic though to get started. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. And if we do want to talk about greenhouse gases, we can do that as well. I just had to focus somewhere. Okay, but thanks everybody.
Sounds great.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you all.
Bye.
See you around.
Thank you.